here I have a parallelogram, and notice that we have opposite sides parallel, opposite sides congruent, opposite angles congruent, all that stuff. That is the property of a parallelogram. Okay, now look what happens when I shift the parallelogram to make 90 degree angle. Notice that all four angles become 90 degrees, and now the shape is more specifically a rectangle. So see how easy it was? Just here's a parallelogram and here's a rectangle. So for this reason, a rectangle is actually a type of parallelogram, but it's got a couple of extra properties. One property is the right angles. That's actually the definition of a rectangle. A rectangle has four right angles. And the other property is that the diagonals, the diagonals are congruent. Okay, unlike a parallelogram where the diagonals are different lengths. Okay, you see how these are different lengths. These are the diagonals of a parallelogram. The diagonals of a rectangle are exactly the same length, and they also bisect each other. So the difference in a diagonals, let's look at the diagonals of a rectangle. See that all of these four pieces right here are exactly the same, which is not true for just a parallelogram where we have these two pieces the same, these two pieces the same, but these two pieces are not the same. Okay, but in a rectangle, you have all of these four pieces the same. So if I took these diagonals and I put a dot inside each end, and then I connected you see how we make a rectangle? Whoops. Well, my artwork isn't great. But so again, the distance from one corner to the other corner is exactly the same in a rectangle. So the two additional things in a rectangle is that we have four right angles, and that's actually the definition of a rectangle. And the other thing is that we have congruent diagonals.
All right, let's go over the properties of a rectangle. So once again, a rectangle is a type of parallelogram. And because it's a type of parallelogram, it has all of the properties of a parallelogram. Opposite sides, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Both pairs of opposite sides are also congruent. And you can also say that one pair of opposite sides is both parallel and congruent, and that would force the other two pairs to also be parallel and congruent. Opposite angles are also congruent in a rectangle. Consecutive angles add up to 180. So those two angles add up to 180. These two angles add up to 180. These two add up to 180, and so on. And finally, diagonals bisect each other. That means that we know that these two pieces are the same, and these two pieces are the same. So on top of being a parallelogram, a rectangle has additional properties. And these additional properties are right here. So not only are opposite angles congruent, but they are actually all 90 degrees each. So all four angles are congruent, or you could say they are all right angles, every single one of them. Additionally, rectangles have congruent diagonals. In other words, if you started at this corner and you walk to this corner, that would be the same distance as going from this corner and going to that corner. Okay, so that diagonals are congruent. So what that means is if we also know that they bisect each other, we also know that all of the pieces are congruent. All of them are congruent to each other in a rectangle. What else do we know about rectangles? Well, if we chop up the rectangle right here, then we have two congruent right triangles. So this triangle is congruent to this triangle. What else do we know about rectangles? Well, if this side and this side are congruent to each other, then we have an isosceles triangle. And that triangle is congruent to this triangle right here. So we have that relationship. Additionally, over here, we have congruent sides as well. So this triangle is congruent to this triangle. So there's lots of congruence happening in a rectangle. All right, one last thing. Now, because we know that we have a bunch of isosceles triangles in a rectangle, then not only do we have alternate interior angles congruent, but we have base angles congruent. In other words, these two sides are congruent, so their opposite angles are congruent. And the same thing's happening over here because we have two congruent isosceles triangles. So if this is 30 degrees over here, that's 30, that's 30, that's 30. Okay, same thing is happening on the other side. We know this is 90 degrees over here, right? So this would be 60, this would be 60, this would be 60, and this would be 60. So lots of things happening inside of a rectangle.